project.
Good evening, everyone.
That's cool.
My name is Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Open Mind presentation featuring Dr. Gail Saltz, who is the author of The Power of Different. We would like to welcome Dr. Saltz, who came here from the other coast, from New York, to be with us this evening. We are very grateful to her for making the journey to come to share her knowledge and expertise with us this evening. Dr. Saltz, along with being a published author, is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the New York Presbyterian Hospital Weill-Cornell School of Medicine. That is almost as long as the Jane and Terry Semel Institute for Human Behavior at UCLA. She is a frequent contributor in the media. I'm sure many of you have seen her on Day Show. She's a columnist, a best-selling author, podcast host, and television commentator, and one of the nation's foremost go-to experts on a variety of psychological and mental health issues, especially those pertaining to women's emotional well-being, relationships, and the mental health aspect of current news. And that's really, after the news of this week, really a very poignant and important field of study. And we're all very, of course, moved and shocked by the events of this week in Las Vegas, and our prayers and hearts go out to those people affected. Also with us this evening to participate in the discussion with Dr. Saltz after the presentation is Dr. Robert Bilder, who is a professor of psychiatry and psychology here at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Behavior at UCLA. He directs the Tenenbaum Center for the Biology of Creativity and the Mind Well program of the UCLA Healthy Campus Initiative. So just briefly, for those of you who are here for the first time, and for those of you who have heard me say this many times, I apologize, but the Friends is the support group for the world-renowned Semel Institute, which is one of the leading centers for the study of the mind, brain, and behavior. We are very fortunate to have with us in the audience this evening the director of the Semel Institute, Dr. Peter Wybrow. The Friends is proud to continue to bring thought leaders in science and culture to present programs about mental health issues free to the public. And we can only do this thanks to the support of our members and those of you who attend our Open Mind programs. And as I like to say, membership has its privileges, just like American Express says. So those of you who become members of the Friends, you will always have a reserved seat at all of our Open Mind programs. Even if it says sold out on our website, we always hold back a few seats for our members. So please visit our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. You will find information on how to become a member or friend of the Open Mind. Also on our website, you'll find a calendar of upcoming events. On November 9th, we will be screening the film Monster in the Mind, which is about Alzheimer's. And our faculty discussant will be Dr. Gary Small, who is the director of the Longevity Center here at the Semel Institute. So don't miss that. It's a very, very thought-provoking and poignant film made by a 95-year-old filmmaker, Gene Harper. Following the discussion, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Saltz and Dr. Bilder. If you could write your questions down on the index cards, which I hope that you picked up on your way in, and if you didn't, we'll be passing them around. We prefer to take questions from the cards rather than from the floor. So thank you for following that. And following the Q&A, Dr. Saltz will be signing her book out in the podium. You will have a chance to purchase the book and have it personally signed by Dr. Gail Saltz. So please, if you just silence any electronic devices that you may have with you this evening, and join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Gail Saltz.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you to the Weill Institute for inviting me. I am really pleased to be speaking to you based on my book, The Power of Different, The Link Between Disorder and Genius. And let's see, okay, let me get my clicker here. Okay, all right, all the lights have gone out. Okay. So I wanted to start by talking to you a little bit about our conception in the world that there is a normal brain. We tend to think of the brain like we think of any other organ, like the heart or the pancreas. You know, there's one way it's supposed to be, and if it's not that way, then clearly you must have an illness or there's something terribly wrong. There's normal or abnormal. In reality, the brain is the most complicated of all organs. There are 100 billion neurons in our brain, 100 trillion synapses, synapses being the place where two neurons connect and communicate with each other. And this just gives you an idea, this image, of how connected and complicated the human brain is. And really, the reason that's important to understand is that there really is a tremendous amount of variation in human brains. And later I'll talk about how we're going to have a better and better idea of exactly how varied the human brain is in people who appear to be normal or don't have symptoms of some sort. But really, there is tremendous variation. So the idea that you all have the same brain if you don't have a symptom going on simply isn't the case. We all have actually quite different brains. Here's another image to give you an idea. And the reason I contrast these is that people also tend to think of the brain as having various structures, and that it's all about the structure. So is that structure normal or not normal, when really there are a tremendous number of varied areas of the brain that potentially control or interact with or inhibit certain kinds of behaviors or thoughts or actions or feelings. And the money, as they say, is really in the connection between different areas. So the previous slide that I showed you of how varied, how many pathways there are, how many connections there are, is really what's important about the brain in terms of brain differences. So in my book, rather than talking so much about diagnoses, I really spend most of the time talking about areas that have to do with symptoms. So you may or may not be familiar with, as a psychiatrist, the manual or the Bible, as it were, that psychiatrists and mental health professionals use to talk about what might be going on with somebody is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and we are up to number 5. And it's actually a hotly debated topic because we do use this manual, which has all the diagnoses in it, so depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and every kind of disorder that mental health professionals recognize is in this manual. And it is important, and we do use it because it allows clinicians to speak with one another about what might be going on in a shorthand sort of way with a particular patient. But more importantly, and sadly perhaps, it allows clinicians to talk to insurance companies so that, yes, we can get reimbursed and you can get reimbursed for your care, and is really the only method we have of operating in terms of the finances of taking care of people. So that's probably, in my mind, the biggest purpose at this point is, in a way, that the DSM-5 is serving, but necessary. And perhaps it's a shorthand for looking at what might happen with a patient in the future in terms of prognosis. But the reality is that clinicians don't really treat patients by the DSM-5, or at least most clinicians don't. They really treat patients in terms of symptoms. So I just realized something I'm not having. Okay, can you hear me? Can you still hear me? Okay. So they treat patients in terms of symptoms. So, you know, when you come in, or someone comes in to see a doctor, they say, you know, my mood feels this way, or I feel nervous, or I'm having difficulty sleeping, or I feel distracted a lot of the time, or I have difficulty relating to others, and I'm going to treat you for that issue. I'm going to look at what's the origin of that, what other symptoms come along with that, and what do I therefore think might be going on, and that's really what I'm going to be treating, whether it's with medication or with some kind of psychotherapy. I'm going to be treating your symptom and not your DSM-5 diagnosis. And so I wanted to create something that's relatable so that you can see yourself or a loved one in what might be going on in terms of the brain. And the reality is, since over half of all of Americans at some point in their life will have a mental health diagnosis, you or someone you love is bound to be in that boat at some point. And I think that we often fail to realize how ubiquitous these kinds of symptoms are for people. And I think we also fail to realize that everybody gets sad sometimes. Everybody gets nervous sometimes. Everybody has difficulty relating sometimes. And these diagnoses have more to do with where you are on that trajectory. Does the mood problem or the anxiety problem or the relatability problem affect your ability to function? And if it causes you difficulty functioning in your relationships, in your job, in your life, then you may need help. And so really the point is, we all have somewhat different brains. We all operate a little bit differently. And the question is, does the difference cause symptoms? Another important concept, something that's been well studied, is what is this connection between extraordinary ability and a brain difference? So yes, you may have symptoms, but many people with symptoms also have an extraordinary ability. In fact, some of them to the point where you would really call them a genius. They are somebody who has done something so extraordinary that in a way it's changed the face of their field, or it's changed the face of our world in some way. So in the book, I use the word genius. Sometimes I'm talking about genius with a capital G, you know, your Albert Einsteins, your Ernest Hemingways, and sometimes I'm talking about genius with a small g. So someone who is really extraordinarily able in some realm and able to do something and be highly successful with it. And what's important to understand about that is that people who have nothing going on, who don't have symptoms, who don't have any sort of mental health issue or learning disability going on, of course they can be creative people, of course they can be successful people, and they often are. But they are actually less likely to be highly creative in a way that leads to some extraordinary accomplishment than is someone who actually has a mental health issue going on, but is mildly to moderately impaired by that mental health issue, as opposed to extremely impaired. So the understanding is that this operates in the inverted U-shaped curve, meaning if you have nothing going on, not that you can't be creative and wonderfully successful, but you actually have a lower likelihood than someone who is in the middle of this curve, who has something mild to moderate going on and is likely to be, more likely to be, that doesn't mean, it does not a guarantee, as I'll go along you'll see, but more likely to be highly creative. And people who have severe illness are really, in some ways, maybe the least likely to be. And that is not because they don't have the wiring to be highly creative, but it is because when you are highly symptomatic, it makes it very difficult to manifest whatever your strength is. And part of the point of this is to let people understand that it is very important to seek treatment. As I go on, it's going to sound all very rosy and wonderful, but I do want people to understand that symptoms can make you suffer terribly. They can really derail your life, and therefore it is extremely important to seek evaluation and treatment. And many of the things that I'm going to talk about have excellent, varied treatments available to make a huge difference. Okay, so I'm going to start with learning differences. 80% of learning differences really fall into the bucket of dyslexia, which is why mostly I'm talking about dyslexia. Of course, there are other kinds of learning differences. There's dyscalculia, difficulty with math, difficulty with handwriting, difficulty with speech, auditory processing problems, many different kinds of learning issues. But dyslexia ends up being the biggest bucket, so therefore we have the most data available on the issue of dyslexia. Most people think of dyslexia as, I can't see the letters correctly and therefore I cannot read. Most of dyslexia is really difficulty processing what's called phonemes, or parts of a word. So the word garage, a person with dyslexia will have trouble seeing the unit of GAR, AGE, and seeing it as a whole, as a word that means garage. So they have to, we learn to decode at a very young age, and that all comes very naturally. Someone with dyslexia will have difficulty doing that decoding, and that makes reading very, very difficult, sometimes not possible. The interesting thing is that the part of the brain that has to do with encoding those phonemes may not be wired in such a way that someone with dyslexia can use it, but other areas, and this is the point really, when one area does not have, let's say, the connectivity to allow for a certain kind of ability, other wiring is different as well. And because wiring in one area is connected to another area, it affects other areas as well. And so if you look at the data, it seems that people with dyslexia often have an incredible ability to discern patterns. And when I say that, I mean better than somebody who does not have dyslexia. This heightened ability also carries over to visual spatial relations. So they have a deficit in the left hemisphere in terms of connection and ability to read, but in the right hemisphere, which is the area with visual spatial relations, they have this particular strength. They also have what's called wider spatial attention, so where people without dyslexia tend to see, hear, let's say, what's going on in their world. The ability to notice and attend to what's going on in the periphery is something that people with dyslexia seem to have. And many people with dyslexia seem to report higher levels of empathy, manifest great resilience, and perseverance. Now, that may not have anything to do with wiring. It's hard to know. It may have more to do with wiring that's acquired over time. And by that I mean, if you have lived with trying to read in a reading world where you cannot, that is a lot to overcome. And many children with dyslexia have really learned to struggle immensely and overcome and developed great resilience. This book cover belongs to the author, Beryl Benacerraf, is one of the subjects that I interviewed for this book. I interviewed about 50 people who are extraordinarily gifted, have extraordinary ability, but do suffer with a learning disability or a mental health issue. Dr. Benacerraf has extreme dyslexia. She still, to this day, as a radiologist of great renown on the Harvard faculty, often needs to use graphs and charts to incorporate new information for herself. But she, in her medical studies, when she became a medical student, went through a radiology rotation, and an attending noticed that she could see things on x-rays that everybody else could not. That she said, I see this and this, and he said, oh, now that you pointed it out, I'm your attending, I do see it, but I don't know how you saw that. And she reported to me, it was almost as though it jumped out at her, like it was floating, like it was, beeping, like it really was noticeable to her. And she realized that she did have this ability, hence she went into radiology, and she actually is the physician who discovered how to diagnose Down syndrome in babies in utero with ultrasound. The next subject that I covered is distractibility. Okay, we all can be distractible sometimes and have difficulty concentrating on something, but some people really struggle more with the ability to attend than others. This is actually one of the most common diagnoses in childhood particularly. Attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity. But distractibility we tend to think of as, I just can't attend, when the real issue seems to be in an area called the default network, which is an area of great connectivity, many neurons connecting in the brain. And it's not that you cannot attend, it's that it's almost like there's a faulty switch in the default network, which makes it difficult for you to consciously decide when to attend. So the interesting thing about people who struggle with this is that they are having a great flow of thoughts. They are having basically daydreams a lot of the time. Now, when you're in school, that can be problematic. If you're staring out the window and your teacher is trying to teach you something specific, but you find that something specific kind of boring, then you may be looking out the window thinking about something else. The upside about the looking out the window and thinking about something else, as Albert Einstein's famous story of looking out the window and thinking about riding on a beam of light, is that you have many inward ideas. And often people who have difficulty with this kind of distractibility have highly original, creative ideas in great numbers. Not all of them are going to be good. But once you crank up the numbers, some of them are actually playing the odds going to be good. And so you've got the Richard Bransons of the world, the founder of Kinko's, the founder of JetBlue, the founder of IKEA. Many CEOs, founders of businesses, particularly entrepreneurial types, do actually have the diagnosis of ADD. I interviewed Stephen Stanley, who is, you probably won't know, but the most decorated paleontologist in the country. And he did not discover until he was an adult that what he had been struggling with his whole life was ADD, but he struggled mightily to attend. But what he also manifested is something that's seen in people with this kind of distractibility, which is called hyperfocus. So while you can't decide when you want to attend, when something really jazzes you and you have this issue, and you're excited about it, then you may hyperfocus. Unfortunately, for many little boys who struggle with ADD, that's often video games, which is not something that's particularly useful to be focusing on. But if you're Albert Einstein, then focusing on physics and what is happening in terms of physics might allow you to sit down in a period of a week and write 3 of the most altering papers based on your discoveries in the field of physics and win a Nobel Prize. The ability to hyperfocus on something that interests, basically because it bathes your brain in the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter of reward. And so that helps the person with distractibility to stay really focused in on what they're doing. People with distractibility often have, along with that, high impulsivity. Again, in a kid, that can be a problem. But this kind of impulsivity in a grown entrepreneur often allows them to take risks and really pursue their out-of-the-box thoughts. And they may be highly successful with that. Anxiety is probably the most common symptom that people complain of. It is one of the most common issues for children. 1 out of every 4 to 5 kids will present with an anxiety disorder. It is the most common bucket of disorders in adults as well. I just put this slide up at the top about stress and the brain, because the problem with anxiety is that when you have high anxiety, you also release a chemical, a hormone called cortisol. And when your brain is bathed in cortisol for long periods of time, it ultimately kills neurons off, which is why chronic stress is such a problem. So again, just like with any of these other issues, if anxiety is derailing your life and impeding you, then I highly recommend you seek treatment. There are great treatments for anxiety, but many people with high anxiety are very diligent, pay great attention to detail, are particularly perfectionistic. They're very driven. They tend to be hypervigilant. And that's both in terms of reading the environment and emotionally reading people. I mean, think about from an evolutionary perspective, right? If you were the cave person and you were the anxious cave person, then you didn't come out of the cave unless you were positive no bears were going to be there. And you were the one who didn't get eaten, which is why anxiety continues to be passed along, evolutionarily speaking. I'm a Jew. I was the one who left. I was the one who, the anxious pre-reading one is the one who tends to keep passing on their genes, as it were. And it's interesting because there are many people who have taken a look at the evolutionary continuity of various mental health issues. And I spoke to a number of neuroscientists who talked about this coevolution of high intelligence moving along with worry, which makes a lot of sense in certain ways because of worry is a normal danger signal, which actually helps us to survive. Melancholy, or depression, everybody gets sad sometimes, but there is a big difference between sadness that goes away and sadness that persists, that makes it difficult to sleep, that changes your appetite, that causes something called anhedonia, the lack of taking pleasure in anything, that makes you think life isn't worth living. 1 out of every 10 people will struggle with depression at some point in their life. It is important to understand that when you are in the depths of depression, you are probably not producing much of anything. I interviewed Andrew Solomon, who was here at this lecture series, I think 2 years ago, for this chapter about depression. And he spoke very eloquently about the fact that while it is true that during the depths of depression, the worst periods, if you read Noonday Demon of his depressions, he could not write or do much of anything. It was sort of the on the way down and on the way out from the worst periods that he benefited from. What he would absolutely say are these particular strengths: incredible empathy, a sensitivity, an ability to stand in other people's shoes, which he used to write many of his books. And in fact, it's the reason that people often reach out to him and share their stories with him, because he does tap in this empathetic way, and then he can write about it in a depth that resonates for all of us. The increased insight, realism. So it's interesting, I have Abraham Lincoln here, who many of you may know struggled with terrible bouts of depression from being a very young person on. He's known for contemplating suicide many times in his life. He definitely embodied empathy as a president, unusually. He's always put in the top 3 list of presidents. I think part of what made him such a great president was his ability to read other people well, to tap into what was going on, and to bring people together in that sense, and be that kind of leader, and to have insight and foresight about what was coming. But one thing that was very valuable was clearly his realistic view of what was going on in the nation at the time. So one thing that's interesting is there have been a number of studies that have looked at how do depressed people look at the world. And we tend to think, oh, they see the world in this very negative and black light. Really, that's mostly not true. In many ways, People who are not depressed see the world in a very optimistic and rosy glasses sort of way. People with depression tend to see the world in a more realistic way. And you could think, who needs all that realism, especially right now? But if you're president of the United States and you have a division in the country and you're going to have war, that kind of realism makes you a very, very valuable president and leader. And obsessiveness, which can be a problem, but also can be a doggedness to pursue something, and a perfectionism, another strength known for people who struggle with depression. Cycling mood. People may know this by manic depression or a bipolar disorder, but I talk about cycling mood because many people have something called cyclothymia, which is mild ups and milder downs. But basically the point is you have periods of depression or melancholy, and you have other periods where you may feel elated or expansive or perhaps highly irritable, sped up. You have something called flight of ideas, where ideas come very quickly, and so quickly that when you are speaking them, even though you may be speaking quickly, the ideas may sound like they don't go together, but actually in your mind, they do go together. So what's important about this is that there is a lot of data to support the value of being hypomanic. Unfortunately, people cannot stay hypomanic. They head into either mania, which includes psychosis or loss of a break with reality, which is very dangerous, or they sink back into a depression. Probably if you told people they could stay mildly hypomanic for life, they'd be pretty happy about that. Unfortunately, that's not the case, but there is a lot of data to support that people with hypomania experience a tremendous diversity of thought. They have these rapid associations, as I mentioned, this flight of ideas, and that allows them to experience tremendous creativity, original thought. They have what's called heightened linguistic ability. So it's interesting, there were some studies done that looked at twins, actually within the past couple of years, looked at twins, where one identical twin had bipolar disorder, the other did not, but in the one that did not, they still had somewhat heightened linguistic ability, in other words, a gift for speech, if you will, and a heightened social ability. And that's really interesting because with all of these things that I'm talking about, there's clearly a genetic component. These things do tend to run in families. We just don't know yet for many of them. It's not like there's a gene, or I mean, sometimes there's several genes, or it's a complex interaction between genes and genes in the environment. Still, much of that is not quite, we don't have the specifics yet, but what's important is that clearly bipolar disorder does run in families. That's why it was worth looking at these twins. And when you see that in the non-affected twin, strengths are of the same sort are there, it does tell you something about wiring and some strength being conferred along with this genetic predisposition. Increased confidence, which comes along with hypomania, it's part of actually the problem in a way, because people can become very grandiose, overinflated confidence that's not based on something that's really going on. But increased confidence can be a good thing when it is based in reality. And this passionate emotional intensity. Many artists, writers, actually a disproportionate number do have bipolar disorder. Think about Ernest Hemingway. And many people have studied the rates of bipolar disorder in poets and writers, and it's really remarkably high. Divergent thinking. What is divergent thinking? So basically it means if you were presented with a problem, say you were shown a screwdriver, what can you use this screwdriver for? Most of us would come up with your pretty basic answers, screw in this screw. But people who are divergent thinkers would come up with other answers that might not seem so obvious to you, and some of them would actually be good answers. Some of them would not. But the importance about divergent thinking is that is where a lot of creative and original thought does come from. Now, when you think about the mental health issues involved with divergent thinking, the data support something called schizotypal thinking, which is, it does contain this divergent kind of thought, but people with schizotypal thinking are often are loners, they don't necessarily relate well to others, so they have issues. They probably won't come see a therapist because the issues don't bother them. They're not that interested in other people and doing the relating, but when studied, they do have this higher rate of divergent thought. It's often related to problem solving. They are potentially original creative problem solvers. They have great persistence. They have higher amounts of risk-taking in terms of implementing their divergent thinking ideas. And they are very sensitive to their environment, not necessarily the people in them. When you take divergent thinking farther down the line, you go toward schizophrenia. Now, I have to be honest and say that everybody I interviewed for this book, no matter how much they struggled and were suffering at various points with their issues, when I asked each of them, which I did, would you give up would you want me to change this diagnosis for you? If I told you to be reborn and not have this issue, would you want that? And they all said no. They all believed and knew about themselves that these strengths that they had were part and parcel of the suffering that they had as well. And they liked who they were, and they liked what they'd been able to accomplish, so they said no. The one person who wavered was the woman down at the bottom. Her name is Ellen Sachs. She is, many of you probably have heard, right? She's a law professor at University of Southern California. She has written over 50 articles and 5 books on the subject of law and mental health. She's a MacArthur Fellowship Award winner, incredibly accomplished. She has looked at many people with schizophrenia and said, most of them would say, no, I don't want to have schizophrenia. It's the most debilitating of all the illnesses that I speak about, and part of the dilemma, in addition to time lost and suffering with psychotic symptoms, is that over time there is often cognitive impairment. So she's increasingly struggling now with the gift that she has, which is her cognitive ability and her divergent thinking. And she's brilliant, but she's losing some of her cognitive capacity. And of course, you may all recognize Professor Nash, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and most likely came up with his game theory during the prodromal phase of his presentation with schizophrenia. So he was not diagnosed when he came up with his theories, but he seemed to have the beginning of symptoms that, in retrospect, that were going on at that time. Relatedness, so I'm really talking about the full autism spectrum, difficulty socially relating to others and picking up on social cues, being able to read that. This is really important, and because the rates of diagnosis are going up, and it's not just because we're getting better at diagnosing, it's because the rates of autism seem to truly be going up. And we are going to have a lot of autistic adults, and really, right now, very, very, very few of them can be employed and therefore live independently. And we need to start thinking about what the strengths are in the autism spectrum and how we might help young people to recognize that, to cultivate that, and to think about how ways that might make them employable. Because there is a clear correlation between things like hypersystemization, or the ability to classify objects. What's interesting is, so they have this decreased facial recognition, and the area, the area that controls that, let's just say, is right next to the area that controls visual acuity, and so it's thought that some of these strengths may occur because an area may recruit from an area where there is weakness. So, yes, These people have difficulty socially seeing what's going on with someone else, but the brain area next door, let's say, may recruit from there and give them better peripheral visual acuity. They really see systems and patterns that others who don't have autism cannot. They have great attention to detail, and of course they have, and this is one of the symptoms of autism, a great comfort in repetition, or what's called perseveration. On the flip side, if you want someone to be able to do something technical, of a computer science potentially nature, that requires tremendous attention to detail, ability to repeat it over and over and over again, I can tell you that people without autism aren't necessarily very good at that at all. Think about Steve Wozniak. There are many people in the Silicon Valley who actually really are on the autism spectrum. They're obviously on the mild end and are functioning well in the community, but their ability to repeat something over and over again and enjoy that and be good at it is very important to them. I interviewed a number of people for this area, but one of the people is named Esther Brokaw. She is on the autism spectrum, and she, in her 30s, was at a museum, was looking at paintings, was seeing the paintings not as you might see a painting, but for her, she saw the patterns in the paintings, the patterns and the brushstrokes. She went home. She's never had an art class in her life. She's never painted anything in her life. She picked up some cheap paints and a paper because she felt like she wanted to try, and this is her first painting. And to her, yes, it looks like what you see, but to her, these are patterns. She painted this by pattern, and she has quite a following now. She is, I mean, you should see the rest of her paintings, but this is her first painting. She's also, interestingly, made a very, very good living as a day trader, because she can see the patterns in the stock market that seem very natural to her, but not necessarily to others. So what about the future of thinking differently? We, unfortunately, it's 2017, we still stigmatize mental health issues tremendously. It makes it very difficult for parents to even recognize that something is going on in a child. Most of these issues will present in late teens, early 20s, but the truth is that many of these things are obvious even earlier on. It's just that parents either don't know what they're seeing, or even more so, they know something is up, but they can't let themselves know something is up because it's so distressing, because it seems like some sort of a death sentence, that they just consciously don't register what's going on. And that's because we've still got it so stigmatized. So it's an average of often 4 to 5 years between the time a child first presents with symptoms and a diagnosis is made. And that's important time lost, because the brain is most plastic in early years, and it's the time when treatment can make the biggest difference. And when I talk to you about connectivity, when something is going on that goes through a certain area of connection once or twice, it's a little pathway, it's a little country road. But when something happens over and over and over again, more and more connections are built up over that pathway. It's called the kinetic effect, and eventually it becomes a superhighway. And when it's a superhighway, it's harder to change. So the point is, we want to start changing things earlier, we want to start recognizing earlier, and we want to recognize that if over half of all Americans will have a mental health issue at some point in their life, then we're not talking about normal or abnormal, because it's not abnormal if it's half of everybody, by definition. I think we have to recognize that biologically speaking, some people are going to be, I like this model that's sort of coming up now, the dandelions versus orchids model. Some people are going to have a biology that allows them to kind of live in anything, if you will, be a weed. You know, they can withstand more trauma when they're young. They can withstand less parenting or less good parenting or all kinds of things going on, and they're going to grow up, they're going to be okay. Some of us biologically are born more like an orchid. We need more tending, we're more sensitive. Trauma might really disrupt us. It might make us wither and not grow. But if we are nurtured and we do grow, then we may be, as it were, the more extraordinary flower. And I think that's a good way to think about some of these issues. I wanted to mention, in terms of the future of this kind of research and thought, is the Human Connectome Project, which is we should have data coming from it. We have some data already coming from it, but we should have more data coming soon. It was started by the Obama Brain Initiative. Let's hope that its funding doesn't get cut. It's a look at 12,000 brains of people who do not present with any of these symptoms. Because the reality is that we don't actually have an accurate and varied map of the, quote, normal human brain. And so it's very difficult to say what a problem is if we don't know the variation in when there's not a problem. So that should provide a lot of interesting information and a lot of guidance. It will probably drive more information about diagnosis, about treatment. We really have a long way to go, I would say, that we have to start thinking about diagnosis in terms of organizing, looking at the neuroscience and the biology and correlating that with symptoms. And hopefully more brain imaging will provide the ability to do that. And I think we also have to start really thinking about our educational systems because, as I said, most of these things present in young people, and our current educational system is really prepared to handle the other 50%. There are certain hoops. Everybody should jump through the same hoop. Everybody should be strong at everything across the board. Educational systems aren't really designed to take into account that many students are what I would call angular students. They're really excellent at something, and they're not excellent at something else. And then instead of sort of trying to get everybody to jump through the same hoop and not being able to take a look at all individually, we are really doing a disservice to many students who then lose self-esteem and sort of fall off the map. So I would just offer, as I wrap up here, how to think about this in your own lives or in the lives of people you love. How does one encourage flourishing? So as I mentioned earlier intervention, better. There's just no question about it. And I think it's important for people to understand there are many different types of treatment, obviously. There are different kinds of psychotherapy. There are new forms of psychotherapy to some degree coming out, it seems like, every few months. There are various medications, and you really have to go to somebody who treats in the particular area that you're concerned about and hear it all out. But I think what people have to understand is that medication affects neurotransmitters, which is essentially brain chemistry, yes, but psychotherapy also affects neurotransmitters. There's a lot of data to support the idea that basically talk therapies of different kinds change brain connections and change brain structure. And so there is more than one way to get at the issue, as it were. When you are dealing with somebody who is dealing with one of these issues, you want to talk with them in school and at home about their ability to lead with strengths. So help them identify what their strengths are. I hope that this will serve a little bit as a guide or a clue to what some of their strengths might be. But I put here, consider neuropsychological testing, because sometimes it's not that apparent. And by testing, you can get a better idea of what And this is true for adults as well, what one's individual strengths and individual weaknesses may be. And many, many of the clinicians and neuroscientists that I spoke to talked about this idea of this 80-20 rule. When people get a diagnosis, they tend to think, I got to spend all my time working on this problem and make it better. And it's understandable because it's upsetting and you feel like, I just have to fix this. But the reality is that that's not necessarily the most beneficial thing to do for the person as a whole. Really, if you think about it, I mean, when you decide you want to lose some weight and get in shape, you don't spend every waking moment at the gym. You might spend a little of your time at the gym, but you're still going to spend most of your time doing things that are otherwise good for you and otherwise bring pleasure in your life and play to your strengths. So the same is true here. Spend 80% of your time introducing the child to different things that might strike their passion, because really what you want to look for is what they're going to get excited about, what they're going to be interested in, what they feel they have an aptitude for, and allow them to spend time immersing themselves in that and building their self-esteem in that, and 20% of your time dealing with whatever kind of therapy or help you might need, tools you might need to build up the weakness. You want to collaborate with educators, so yes, I think things in the system need to change, but in the meanwhile, speaking with an individual teacher, talking to them about, you assigned this project, this is an area that's very difficult for my child, but my child is fabulous in visual spatial relations. Can we, is there a way that we can design the project for them to show what they know in a way that they know it? Teachers are often, if you make that liaison and you help provide some of the ideas, willing to do that. We have to think in society about hiring for strengths. We have to start thinking about how are we going to provide opportunities for people to be independent, but also, frankly, this really benefits businesses. There are more and more businesses that are recognizing this and that are making efforts to reach out to and hire people who have particular kinds of issues, but that make them really well suited and perhaps even the better employee in certain ways for their businesses. We always need more research dollars. This is not the kind of stuff that tends to get research dollars. Why? We always tend to look at research dollars go to what's going to make money for a drug, because it's all about making the money. And it really is a deficit-based model. So there's a problem, how can we look at that problem? We don't tend to look at strengths and how we might accentuate them. I want to say that part of the reason that I have pursued this area and part of the reason that I wrote this book is because the stigma and the shame that keeps people from coming in to see me, from getting the help that they need, from helping their child, from helping their loved one, keeps the 50% of Americans who are dealing with something at the time they're dealing with it in silence. It really destroys self-esteem, and we have to find a way to stop doing it. And I think that by recognizing that there's another side to what's going on, I'm not trying to sugarcoat struggling with a symptom. You should get treatment, but recognizing it's much more complex than this. And there are particular strengths to be gained. To be thinking about this, I think, is really important. And that leads to share your story. Because the more of us that talk about what's going on and how frequently it does go on and what it's like to deal with that and how we've maybe tackled the problem, the less secrecy, the more people will, frankly, just become accustomed to and understanding in a way that actually will make it easier for all of us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so do I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saltz. That was a fascinating talk and just so informative. And I know I've passed the anxiety part down to my family members, so I learned that this evening. And I'm sure that everybody in the room recognized something in a family member or themselves
Thank you.
I'd like to invite both Dr. Builder and Dr. Saltz up to the podium to have a discussion about some of the issues that you heard about this evening. So please welcome Dr. Saltz once again, and Dr. Builder, who is professor of biology and creativity. What a great pair. Thank you.
Well, that was really an inspiration. I hope we can get another round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
Really,
Thank you. Thank you.
I was prepared to be wowed because I read the book, but even more so, I mentioned to my wife that I was going to be having this opportunity to be able to hang out with Gail Saltz. And we come from New York. We were there about 15 years ago. I lived there for about 28 years. But my wife, who had worked at New York Hospital for a while, did something even more important. She watched the Today Show and Oprah. And she says, "You're going to see Gail Saltz? I can see her every morning." She was so inspiring and represented such a combination of sanity, scientific insight, and an ability to communicate to human beings in a rational way. And I think that we've seen that tonight as she's presented the work from her book. And I hope that some of you have read the book and who are going to read the book will come to appreciate it. I had the kind invitation from the friends to be able to come and say a few words about the book, and then I took the liberty of just marking out of the 226 pages, I marked 212 that I'd like to share with you some of it really is great, and I actually did dog-ear 212 pages, each of which had relevant insights. But there were a couple things that really struck me as I was going through the book. One is that not only is it a scholarly work, and one that bridges the gap of not only being scholarly and getting the science right, but also communicating effectively. That is a rare gift. I mean, there are very few authors that we ever encounter. I'm reminded of Carl Sagan, who brought to us some incredible work, expanding the universe, the brain, and other matters. But it really is a gift to get in that sweet spot between the science and the communication, and Dr. Saltz really does as well. But there's something else that I think is really critical, and that is the information there is not only enticing in the way she presents it and easy to connect to, but it's also actionable. And so I think that as she was closing her talk, she related to you a number of the agenda items that we can put before ourselves with this information. And some of the key take-home message to me are what a very valuable strengths-focused approach she brings to us. We often have seen mental illness be dealt with as a series of deficits to be treated and eradicated, to be cured. And I think that we know how that's not easy, first of all. And second of all, is it even desirable? I'm reminded we have something that's really an incredible project here, which I think is really going to change the world. It's called the Depression Grand Challenge, part of our UCLA capital campaign. And I remember when we were first articulating the goals for that, one of the first goals was, we want to eliminate the burden of depression. 50% by 2050, 100% by 2100. And while I could appreciate the value of the goal of eliminating the burden of depression, would we want to eliminate depression? Maybe depression is a critical aspect of certain aspects of our humanity, and there are important things there to preserve as well. So I think that you've helped us to see in this book and in your work the importance of diversity of all kinds. The term neurodiversity has been used to describe this natural diversity of our brains and of our behavior. And I think that you highlight that beautifully and show how for every aspect of behavior that we've considered a disorder, there are also positive aspects. And indeed, not some of us are this way, some of us are that way. We are all sharing positions on all of these dimensions. And where we happen to fit on these dimensions is something for us to discover and figure out and to identify. Oh, well, what are the good things and the not so not-so-good things about being on each one of those dimensions. And I think that that's a critical point that indeed is beginning to be identified in major research projects. The NIH now has new initiatives focused exactly on this topic of identifying dimensions rather than categorical mental illnesses, and I think it's having a great impact. But I think you've done something else with each of these dimensions. You've gone into each of the things that are identified as disorders and focused on each one of those. So for dyslexia, to focus on the complementary aspects of that, providing us with wider attentional control. And the beautiful work of Beryl Benacerraf, who made discoveries in images. The role of ADD, I couldn't concentrate on well enough to understand. But I think there are some great examples in ADD. Of course, anxiety, the capacity to maintain that vigilance and specificity. The beauty of melancholia, the capacity for empathy and realism that has us stripping off our rose-colored glasses is something that's underappreciated. I'm fascinated by the connection to schizotypy and the links to divergent thinking. We just had the luxury to complete a project which we called the Big C Project, a project of exceptionally creative individuals. We had 30 visual artists, 30 scientists, and 30 smart controls, and we compared them and studied their brains, giving them all kinds of brain scans and so on. But there were a few things that were really quite interesting. One is that we looked at schizotypal characteristics, these things like magical ideation and so on, and we found the artists, sure enough, did have more of these kinds of traits. And we found another thing that was interesting that was possessed by both the artists and the scientists, which also connects to something that we raised today. And that is, we're talking about these patterns, these dimensions that go from rigidity to the extremes of flexibility. And when we look at human brain networks and their functional activity, you showed some pretty network pictures, I think in ADHD particularly.
Yes.
But we can see some networks are more organized and some are less organized, more chaotic. And if you look at, for example, a map of, you ever be on an airplane and see those maps of where all the airports are, and you can see that there's like big hubs in LA and Washington, et cetera, and they're connected to all the smaller airports. It's a very organized system. It's very efficient, very organized. It's not that flexible in many ways. But then you can look at brain networks in the same way to see if they're big hub networks and so on. We've got fancy math that we can use to look at that kind of stuff. And a really remarkable thing is that many people expected our big C scientists and artists to be, at least especially scientists, to be more organized and more efficient in the way they handle them. No, both groups showed more chaos, more entropy, and more disorganization in their brain wiring.
Well, most people that have studied genius, let's say, and creativity being a key ingredient in genius, really talk about it being this balance between basically a messy brain and an organized brain. That you have to have a messy enough brain to have this free-floating ideas, these divergent ideas, this chaos. But then you have to have an organized enough brain to use whatever you thought up or got and manifest it. And it's sort of this balance back and forth between messy and neat.
That's right. So I think that it's a beautiful example, and this balancing act is one that I think all of us struggle with, all of us strive for. We wrote a little article. You were kind enough to even cite the paper we wrote that was looking at creativity and exceptional creative abilities as being on the edge of chaos, where we probe the flexibility of our own brains, but at some point have to reel it in order to connect it to reality. Otherwise, the virtues of all that flexibility are not fully realized. And I think that work is entirely consistent. I also love the dandelions and orchids metaphor, and that I think most of us in the audience, there's dandelions out there, but I think most of us are either ourselves or are very close to those who are orchids who need more nurturance. We need to be able to focus on the unique strengths that we have in order to promote the aspects of our diversity that are most wonderful. And finally, I just wanted to mention the impact on education, I think, is really fantastic, especially as the world is becoming more and more automated, as more and more human endeavors are being taken over by machines. I think it's absolutely critical that we begin to focus on those things that are unique to each and every one of us, to identify these kinds of diversity in our own minds that you have identified, to go after them fearlessly, and to find that which is in each of us uniquely human. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now we have some time to hear your questions. Let's see. Okay, so here's one that this comes from the director of the NIMH. No, it doesn't. And it says, when will we know what meds will be the exact one for the given patient? Which basically, I said it's from the NIMH director because the NIH director, Francis Collins, has developed a new precision medicine initiative. But I think the key question there is, how close are we to being able to identify for a given person the kind of treatment, whether it's a medication or a therapy?
Right. I mean, I would have to say not that close. But I mean, currently, there's an attempt to use genetic testing to look at what might be a better medication choice for somebody. I think everybody's very excited about it because it's new. The genetic testing does not say this drug will work. What it does say is, for example, there may be a gene that tells you something about how you metabolize a certain drug, and whether you're going to over-metabolize it so it will be hard to stay in your system, and therefore it might not be the best drug for you, or there are a whole host of sort of a genetic profile that can point you in a direction or not in a direction. I think the jury is still out on how helpful that's really going to be. I could hardly call it designer, it's not like therefore this. I also think we still have a long way to go in terms of medications in general. We came up with, there are very few classes of medications at this point. And one thing that's difficult, I'm just trying to put this into terms so everybody will. One thing that's difficult is that, for example, the neurotransmitter serotonin, which everybody's probably heard, is a concern in, for example, depression. Serotonin isn't just in one little area so that you can give someone the medication and therefore help them with that one little area. It goes to the whole brain so that there are often side effects, there are often other things being changed. We don't really know, for example, the effect of having a child on medication for many, many years. We have some of these medications haven't been around long enough to know what might happen after a decade or two. So I think we still have a ways to go, let's just say, in terms of, I think, medications that have more specificity, and that's really important because in terms of long-term effect, in terms of side effects that people can tolerate, and then in terms of whether this genetic testing will help us to really pinpoint which medication might be the best for somebody. I think it's a good question because the reality is, unfortunately, many people do not respond to the first medication they were given for whatever we could be talking about, and sometimes not the second, and often the third, but sometimes even not the third. And so it can be very frustrating, and difficult process. I think one thing that is helpful for people to understand is that for most of these things, most studies show that that the combination of psychotherapy plus medication is more effective than medication alone. There are a number of psychotherapies that are as effective as medication, and sometimes more, depending on the background of that patient and other features. So depression isn't one problem. There are many kinds of depressions. There are many sort of styles, I guess I'll say, of depression. So some styles respond better to medication. Some styles respond better to psychotherapy. This is why it's important to try to have an evaluation with someone knowledgeable in your area who understands, that one size doesn't fit all.
Fantastic. Another question is, did you interview anyone with a personality disorder, or specifically borderline personality disorder? And what strengths do you find there?
So I do, it is a good one, I do not have a chapter specifically on borderline personality because, as I said, I really was I looked at symptoms. So many people with borderline personality, or who will get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, will have symptoms of depression sometimes, symptoms of anxiety sometimes, symptoms of self-injury or impulsiveness or sexual identity disturbances or relatability disturbances. I didn't look at this constellation that comes together in this very particular way. I am not aware of the data on whether there has been a look at borderline personality and specifically hardwired strengths, but because it's only been recently that there's been some data on what might be causing some of the issues in borderline personality disorder. I'm trying to remember his name now. He's now at the Brigham and Women's, and he and his wife have done a number of studies that have looked at an area that normally inhibits a certain kind of impulsivity, but is lacking in people with borderline personality disorder, and therefore they exhibit this impulsivity. So there is some neuroscience afoot in terms of diagnosis. Hopefully it wouldn't be far behind then to look at what the strengths might be, but I'm not particularly, I can't speak from a science point of view on that.
Okay, well, there's a rich area for further investigation.
Definitely.
There is an intense sensitivity to interpersonal relatedness.
Yes.
And that may...
we could conjecture. We certainly could conjecture. I've seen many people with borderline personality disorder who are wonderfully sensitive, and sometimes it's a problem for them that they suffer the pain of being that sensitive. But sometimes they're wonderfully sensitive people to be with, actually, when relationships are going well.
There you go. Well said. What about the effects of aging? We often focus on the disadvantages. What about the strengths that come with aging?
Right. Well, there is no question but that with age comes wisdom, and comes perspective, and comes often a resilience. There's no question but that experiences that are had change the brain, and in many cases for the better. I think if you look at most curves that have to do with happiness or that have to do with mental health issues, the older population suffers less. Unhappiness peaks in midlife, really. I can't tell you from a data perspective all of the reasons why that might be so, because I don't think it's known, but certainly the perspective of having lived a life and ridden through many things and come out the other end clearly changes things in terms of the brain. And it's also true that, for instance, John Nash, his schizophrenia was minimal by the end of his life. Many borderline personality disorder, actually, schizophrenia, many anxiety disorders, and even bipolar disorder, many disorders really are less present or even gone sometimes. It's not clear why. It's often referred to as sort of burnout of the disorder that happens later in life. So many people who may have struggled through their lives earlier do not struggle later, and also seem to, in many regards, have better mood.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I can add, just because I'm a neuropsychologist, I have to add this, that there's some, which I think many of us would believe, that even though we may lose our memory as we get older, we make up for it by gaining executive control and better, it's a wisdom over brute strength of being able to remember stuff.
Something to look forward to.
To suggest that's true. This is interesting. Many brilliant doctors and surgeons have issues, but obviously written by a brilliant doctor, surgeon, but will not go for psychotherapy. They'll take medications for the way they're feeling or thinking. But why is that?
Why is that? Well, I don't know if I can answer. Well, I don't know if I can answer for every brilliant doctor and surgeon. But I think there is. I think there is national stigma in terms of psychotherapy, but I think that doctors are often the worst patients, and there's a feeling of doctor heal thyself, as though doctors shouldn't have those kinds of problems. I think there is a growing awareness of the fact that doctors are human. There's actually a very high rate of depression in medical school and in residency training. I think there had been a lack of awareness of that. That's more recent data that has come up, and I think it's impacting the field. I think that substance abuse in physicians has really come to the fore, and we have a greater understanding of the need for treatment and self-reporting. And I think, why? Because it's easy to think I can just take a medication and not have to wrestle with. It's harder to be in psychotherapy. There's no question about it. It's hard work. I don't want, good psychotherapy is not supportive only psychotherapy. It's not, let me just, you can just spiel and I'll just comfort you. Good psychotherapy is struggling. It's bringing up things that are difficult. It's understanding conflict, or in the case of cognitive behavioral therapy, it's doing repetitively things that are hard to do, that you don't want to do, and practicing them. So I think physicians tend to have a feeling of self-judgment, that they've gone through medical school and training, and they're the one that people are looking to, and therefore they shouldn't have this weakness and need to do this. So that's unfortunate. Mostly for them, they suffer tremendously. Sometimes for patients who have to be on the other end of it. I think as we raise awareness all around, hopefully it will raise awareness for physicians as well. Not that I know if they'll be able to afford it or not, because the way things are going in our healthcare system, I'm not convinced that doctors will be able to make a living after a while. But
well, that actually segues perfectly into the next question, which from the handwriting I can tell it comes from the same doctor or surgeon who asked that question. How does the care differ in countries that offer full medical care and in single-payer systems? How do they distinguish mental health care from care for medical illnesses?
Yeah, I think a really depends on the country. I have limited, I have spoken with colleagues in some other countries. In countries where there is, frankly, less stigma and more understanding of mental health issues being like any other health issue. I think Canada, mental health care is pretty good. It's because it's seen culturally as any other kind of medical issue, and I think that's really what makes the difference. And it's not so much about private pay versus, a national system, but of course, in a national system, uniformly people can get it, but you have to understand that there is triage, and then it's a limited resource. So that's a dilemma, because many of these issues you cannot really resolve in a matter of 5 sessions or something like that. So I don't know the solution to this, but I guess I'll back it up and say this. Right now in this country, the number one source of disability is depression. That is the number one financial reason people, for a health reason, can't go to work. And billions of dollars in disability and productivity lost are spent on the subject of depression. And if we, as a country, and countries who are aware of this try to do, were aware of the financial gain that would be made from doing more what I would call preventive mental health care, that we would recognize when someone was even, in a stressful situation or in a high-risk situation or genetically predisposed, and thought about and helped them to be able to incorporate things into their lives that had to do with preventive care, just as we do in every other medical area. If we know that high blood pressure runs in your family, then you go for a checkup, and we watch your blood pressure, and we tell you to eat a low cholesterol diet, and we do what needs to be done so that we don't have to spend the money later taking care of, doing open heart surgery or whatever might be necessary because we didn't take care of that earlier. Similar things can be done in mental health care. That we know, for example, exercise has tremendous impact on depression and anxiety. And if you knew that this was of concern to you and you had a prescribed program of exercise, if you had a prescribed program of mindfulness, if you had a prescribed program of perhaps even touching in and doing some psychotherapy up front, preventatively, and of course there will be people who will need it later and you can't prevent everything, we would probably have we would spend many fewer dollars. There's a lot of data to support this. So some countries are more aware of that. I think Canada is actually one of them, and I think that makes a big difference. But in fairness, there are other countries where, it's even, there is no mental health care at all. It's not recognized, if your relative manifests behavior that is disturbing, you hide them in the closet, literally. And so in that regard, we do all right.
I do want to mention for the home team that Dr. Weibrow has initiated a new division here at the Institute, which is a division of population behavioral health, which is aiming to do almost exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about, to try to bring to UCLA Health a broad reach back into to primary care networks, to begin preventive health, and to provide mental health services across a much broader spectrum of our patients.
I applaud that.
Dr. Weibrow. The next question is also a bit of a segue from that, and you can also, it's a documentation that this person was listening very carefully to what you said, because it says, is there a way to protect the brain from corticosteroids that may be released by stress, especially in young brains? So what can we do?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah.
Like corticosteroid release.
So acute corticosteroid release does not cause brain cell death. It's really chronic. And so the point is that you can't stop the unknown trauma from happening that you're going to have a reaction to. But what you can try to manage is how long does it go on. So again, here's where preventive mental health care or going into a psychotherapy, or perhaps if you need medication, getting an evaluation for medication can make a big difference. So if something, for instance, we could be talking about people who were in Las Vegas when this happened who have survived and okay, but some of them, a percentage of them, may go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. They were present, their lives were at risk, and they may have seen people be killed. So initially, this acute stress reaction that they'd be having would be understandable, you would expect it. Some of them would be at risk for PTSD, perhaps because of family history, because of previous trauma, because of previous mental health issues that they may have, and if people could be educated on at what point, right, this has gone on too long, this many weeks, these kinds of symptoms, and frankly go in, have an evaluation, and receive treatment, because that's what prevents the chronic stressor from essentially going on. There are certain circumstances, for example, being a caregiver, that classically, people who are caregivers of someone very close to them, and it's relentless and it goes on and on, are in that kind of chronically stressful situation, and they often, after a long period of time, they start to have, burnout, they start to have depression themselves and so on. And so, it's important that, again, the education to know that one cannot remain a sole caregiver without relief, without intervention, and that's just as important as the caretaking you're doing, is to take care of yourself. So it's really about interrupting the process, whether that's with treatment or with adding accoutrements that help you remove the stress, such as exercise, sleeping well, talking with others.
That's great. And I think we're towards what should be probably the last question, and this is a very demanding question because it requires your expertise not only as a highly trained physician, psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, but also as a major media personality. Any thoughts about the new TV series, The Good Doctor?
So I admit I haven't seen it. So I feel so bad. But I was speaking earlier with some of you about this, that much of America does get its medical education and its mental health education from television dramas. That's just a fact. You have here the Norman Lear Center is well aware of that. They provide physicians. I have done this for the Norman Lear Center myself for the program in treatment, to be consultants to programs to try to help the information be more accurate, because, like it or not, that's where people learn their information often. So I would simply say, I think it's great that there's a show that tells people anything about people with autism. I think it's great that they have decided to show the person with autism as being highly competent and capable, because that often is the case, but people don't know that. And then the question remains as to how accurate or ridiculous the writers choose to get.
So hopefully they will consult you about that. Anyhow, thank you, audience, for listening, for wonderful questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saltz and Dr. Builder. Fascinating Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. Please support the Open Mind programs. We couldn't bring speakers like Dr. Saltz here without your help. And thank you. Drive carefully. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.